Hi, and welcome to the Rare Business Podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm a consultant, advisor, researcher, and writer on all things related to customer service and customer experience. Through this podcast, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, and leading thinkers about what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees in this fast-moving modern age that we live in. If this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then welcome, and please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsco.com, as I've now completed over 250 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then thank you for returning, and I'll aim to do a good enough job to keep you coming back week after week. Anyway, that's enough from me right now. Let's get into the interview. So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Jessica Groopman and Jeremiah Owyang, who are both industry analysts and founding partners at Kaleido Insights. Hi, Jessica. Hi, Jeremiah. How are you doing?
Hi, Adrian.
Great.
So, Jessica, Jeremiah, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a bit about you and a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure.
Gladly.
I guess I'll kick things off.
Go ahead, Jeremiah.
Jessica. Okay, I'll start off and then pass it back to you. So I'm an industry analyst, and I've conducted research for over 10 years. I used to be at Forrester, founding partner at Altimeter Group, and now a partner at Kaleido Insights. And I'm constantly looking at how new technologies are helping companies to connect to their customers. And so your podcast obviously is a great fit for this type of discussion. Over to you, Jessica.
Yep. Also an industry analyst and have also been at a few different research firms over the years and really tracking closely a number of different technologies. As of late, deep into the blockchain space, but have been an IoT analyst for a number of years now. And we're both kind of helping companies grapple with this new reality where it's not just one technology that's happening that sort of lays the groundwork for the next, but there are many technologies that companies are trying to make sense of and activate, all happening at the same time. So that keeps us busy.
It's like making sense of spaghetti.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's true that the number of technologies that are coming are just increasing at a rapid pace. What are you seeing, Adrian? Do you think it's increasing, the frequency?
I think it is increasing. I think there's a little bit of shiny object syndrome going around. But I think there's, I also think that there's a little bit of head in the sand type stuff going on as well. It's like, because there's too much, and some people going, no, don't talk to me about any more. The kind of the day-to-day stuff is hard enough. Don't talk to me about any more new stuff. It's
very true.
So
That's true.
And so therefore, it's trying to simplify some of this stuff and actually get through to what is it that really matters and where can it really make an impact for both customers and employees is kind of what I'm really interested in. I like technology, but I'm more interested in the human impact on both sides of the organizational wall.
Right.
So, to the topic of the podcast. Now, back in March, Jeremiah, you posted a piece on your blog, which I've been a subscriber to for a while now, because I follow your stuff. And you posted a piece called Analysis, Should Blockchain Power Your Customer Loyalty Program? And I saw the title and I went, what? And I was like, oh my God, let me have a look at that. And it caught my interest and I got into it and I was like, blimey. That's kind of just made me think about all sorts of different things. And I thought, well, I have to invite you onto the podcast, so thank you for coming on. I think it's kind of a really interesting thing. But before we get into it, because there's a lot of talk about blockchain technology and also the associated Bitcoin stuff and the ICOs and stuff that goes with that. But I think the blockchain itself, I think, is a really interesting piece of technology. But for people that aren't familiar with it in terms of the actual what it is and the nuts and bolts of it, could you give us a quick, what I would say, a 101 insight from your perspectives on what you think what blockchain is and why you think companies should be paying attention to it?
Sure. So a definition is it's a distributed ledger that is more secure than having just a centralized database or distributed database.
Right.
And essentially, it's very hard to understand, but essentially imagine if each one of us, all three of us, and the readers here and listeners, all had a copy of the same blockchain. And if we decided to update one to say, hey, who has the ball? Today, let's imagine we're passing around a golden ball, and then we could update everybody's ledger, and we would all know who has this supposed golden ball. Jessica, how would you add any color to that?
Yeah, I think it's important to unpeel a couple of those terms. One is ledger. Most people didn't know really what a ledger was, other than accountants, until blockchain came along. And I think that the simplest way to think about it is a database. We can all see the same transactions taking place, a shared database. Transaction is another word I peel back on a little bit too, because we also think of transactions as being monetary. But on a blockchain or with this concept, distributed ledgers, transactions are just events taking place. So a transaction could be me casting a vote. It could be me, downloading a program or scanning a barcode or accessing a medical record. A transaction is simply something that we have agreed on prior to this taking place that defines the event. And then the third piece that I always kind of peel back on a little bit is what happens once everyone in the network verifies that transaction. From there, we get an immutable record. This means that blockchains are append only. Nothing can be deleted or erased from a blockchain, and this is part of what enhances the security. So that immutability piece is really a breakthrough in computing, because we haven't had a way where we couldn't erase something from happening, and that's really inherent to this technology.
So it seems to me that so like you say, it's distributed, it's immutable, it records things, but it's also, it will protect from things like fraud, and there's an additional security element to it, and so I can see there's probably applications across the organizational landscape for some of this sort of stuff. Everything from contracts to, if you like, career records to all sorts of different things. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, it can be used when there's many different parties involved, and this is a great way to keep everybody in check. And that's kind of like the key thing. Now, I just want to make sure we identify what we're talking about. We're not talking about Bitcoin, which is a derivative of blockchain. We're not talking about, actually, we might be talking about ICOs in just a sec, initial coin offerings. So let's hold off on that. So we're really not talking about the craze of all these cryptocurrencies. We're talking about how blockchain can be used for business. Yes, there's an element of the cryptocurrencies, and we'll get to that in a sec. But we just want to make sure that we're trying to stay away from some of that frothy hype. And I've been to some events and parties in New York and Silicon Valley where people are trying to sell me their coin, and it's really ridiculous. It is ridiculous. So
that's a huge point. There's a lot of confusion in the market today, as we all are familiar, and a lot of it does come around this element of what is crypto and what is blockchain. And even within the blockchain side of that, dichotomy, if you like, there are many different permutations. There's public blockchain, there's private blockchain. We won't necessarily get into those, but when it comes to enterprise applications, we're talking about a much smaller sort of slice of the blockchain universe than all things crypto, all things coin related, all things blockchain related. There's different configurations that are much better suited for the enterprise environment.
Fantastic. I mean, as a bit of an aside, I don't know if you've heard of a guy called Hernando de Soto, who is a Peruvian economist and activist who has always been an advocate for land rights, particularly for people that are peasant farmers in places like Peru and other places around the world, and has done some tremendous work around establishing land rights where there was no records. And he's come out and said, this blockchain technology, this distributed ledger technology is a game changer for land rights, for small holdings around the world. And I was just thinking, that's awesome. Because I remember doing some work with Hernando de Soto in the 90s and stuff, and I think he's a great guy. But to see him just pop up and go, Hernando de Soto and blockchain technology, I thought, yeah, that makes sort of total sense in terms of establishing ownership.
It's fascinating to see some of these use cases pop up in one area, as you mentioned, in like land titling, and then we start to see similar permutations take shape in other domains. So, for example, like copyrights associated with music, or certifications or for different trades, like a doctorate. If you achieve a doctorate in one country, having a kind of immutable ledger that records that. These ideas that take one idea. The same is true for supply chain.
Yeah.
We're seeing some supply chain applications that are now migrating into the media space, media supply chain.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see the innovation kind of cross industry boundaries.
Excellent.
Every industry is starting to pick up on it. And I think that's kind of the genesis of the post that we collaborated on, myself, Jessica, and our other partners.
Yeah.
Should we touch upon that?
I think that was you've beaten me to my next question, Jeremiah, because I was about to say, so let's get into this article and kind of tell me why it came about and why it seems like some companies are actually adopting the blockchain technology for their loyalty programs, because that seems to be, I mean, there's obviously they're facing problems and there's a response to that, but it's also they're seeing potentially other benefits as well. So can you tell me a little bit about the article and kind of what you found out when you did your research?
Thanks. Well, as Jessica pointed out, we're seeing it across multiple industries, and we're also seeing it in supply chain adoption, and I'm seeing it in insurance industry. But in particular, we wanted to focus on how marketers might be using this.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say we're the first ones to tackle this topic. Jeremy Epstein, who has been focusing on blockchain and marketing, is a friend of ours, and he's covered this. But we decided to do our own peer behind the covers and see how many companies might be approaching this. And we found just under 10. There's probably more now. And essentially, these tend to be focused around the loyalty program.
Yeah.
So a customer loyalty program is where we really honed in on this. And we found some examples where companies want to enable all of their partners among the loyalty program. Let's imagine you're a retailer, and every time your customer purchases something, they earn these points for your brand, which could be traded for airline points or credit card points or Amazon points, or maybe be used on a third-party market to buy and sell, or maybe the company uses them so customers get discounts. There's a number of ways that loyalty programs can convert those points. And in many cases, these loyalty programs are fragmented. There might be a third party that is administrating this. There's a number of companies. There's a large one, AMIA in Toronto, that I've spent time with, and there's other ones out there. But there's dozens of folks that might be involved, and it's very confusing, not just for the marketing department who runs loyalty, but also for the end customer. So that was kind of the pain point. Jessica, do you want to paint some color on the business need here first?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can both enterprises and consumers feel some of the pain when it comes to current loyalty programs. The average American, for example, is a member of some 30 different programs, but also has a retention rate of roughly a quarter. Roughly a quarter of people stay in these membership programs. So there's a problem here. On the business side, when it comes to building out these loyalty programs, it's a tremendous systems integration hassle, simply to pilot programs like across different brands. And that's only with one other company. And then there's contract negotiations for larger organizations. There's a big issue around balance sheet liability, being able to reckon and reconcile how much of these points or dollars associated with these points have actually been redeemed. That's a difficult thing to do in current, especially enterprise loyalty programs. There's also a tremendous amount of fraud and counterfeit in this space. So both consumers and brands understand the theoretical value of a loyalty program, but have struggled to really activate this to something that is fungible, transferable, sort of lightweight, that is as agile as we think of many digital marketing programs today. So from that standpoint, we're operating on both sides of the equation with a lot of opportunity. And that's where we see blockchain coming in as a way to not only encode the rules of loyalty programs. Sure. If I scan a barcode or take a photo of an image, then I will get points. That's a smart contracts play. You can encode the rules of the program into the distributed ledger. That becomes much more reliable way to track and trace exactly what's happening to better resolve that balance sheet liability, makes it much more flexible, gives end consumers a much better incentive to actually redeem. Imagine, as Jeremiah mentioned, the ability to buy whatever, groceries or gas using airline miles, or have some kind of exchange program across companies, say within a shared industry, or maybe within a holding, underneath a holdings company umbrella, or simply a partnership that is already partnered around a specific product or specific ecosystem.
I mean, you talk about liability there. I mean, and it reminds me of this and loyalty programs and stuff, and keeping a close record of things and having them work across categories or across kind of verticals, be transferable. And then it makes me think about how some airlines actually, they started off their air miles kind of programs, and then some of which in the early days were redeemable for cash or actual physical things, or you could buy whole tickets with them. And then they went through a process of revaluing them when they better understood the liability. Is there a risk then that some companies may have to be very clever about what they do, because in terms of what they get themselves tied into, what gets recorded? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds like business partner selection. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, no. So that I remember there was let me explain. There was there was an air miles kind of program, a bunch of programs
right.
that in the early days, and in the early days it was quite simple. The more miles the more flights that you took, the more miles that you got, and then there was this redemption process that you could exchange. You could buy complete flights with your miles,
right?
And some of them have actually backed away from that because they actually they've sort of reevaluated the relationship.
Inflation or deflation of the said points as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Market changes. Yeah. Well, so if there was a business rule in that case, let's say if airline prices go up significantly because oil goes up for some reason,
right?
You could encode that in the blockchain and say, at this point, it would be this particular action would happen where it would be nullified.
Okay.
And that would be built-in logic you can build into the blockchain, which is a part of the smart contracts aspect of that.
Okay.
So, but you'd have to have the foresight to pre-plan that. Jessica?
Well, and yeah, I mean, another element of this too is when it comes to tokens, which hopefully we won't get too deep on the weeds on, but a simple kind of supply demand economics rule applies to this, where, in effect, the larger the network is using these tokens, the higher the value of the tokens. That's why this ICO thing has blown up so much, because it abides by the laws of supply and demand. There are fixed numbers of rewards, for example. So you could think about different ways to either introduce new parts of the network, or to scale back on the network, or to make divisible the value of the token given these specific whatever changes in gas prices or whatever the case may be. There's an element of this sort of microeconomy that exists within these loyalty programs, or any blockchain with a tokenized asset for that matter.
Okay.
That doesn't confuse things too much.
No, I think so. I mean, forgive me for asking sometimes, simple questions. I just because I'm trying to understand that both for myself, but also hopefully on the behalf of my listeners.
It's a confusing topic. No,
it is.
We'll walk you through it. Don't worry.
Yeah. And so the other thing,
maybe we could do some case examples as well.
Let's get to that. But because first of all, I want to ask you the skeptic question, which is we've many of us might have heard of the company that renamed their small brand, that renamed themselves and put blockchain or Bitcoin in their name, and their stock went up 300%. So is it all hype, or is actually there's something real here?
You want to take that one, Jeremiah? I have many thoughts on that. Go ahead.
I think there's a lot of hype here. I think I'm very wary. So I don't ask my clients to pay me in Bitcoin, and my retirement has 0% Bitcoin as its holding. I think there's a lot of froth, and you can even see how Bitcoin peaked about a year ago and has now just gone down and is going up and down. And it was supposed to be a secure bet against the dollar falling or oil, and it didn't happen. It went down when the stock market went down as well. So I think there's a lot of froth here. And I think because there's low barriers to entry, anybody can create an ICO, initial coin offering. And it reminds me of crowdfunding like 4 years ago, where anybody can launch a crowdfunding campaign. Any company or individual can launch an ICO, but there's a lot of risk involved. So we're trying to pull back past that to find where the real business applications are. Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, there is a lot of hype in the space, to be sure. And there's a lot of froth. There's even a lot of fraud, especially in some of the kind of cryptocurrency markets. not at the blockchain level itself, but on the applications on top, on some of the startups that are trying to sort of, pump and dump schemes. That said, and I mentioned this at the top of the call, the difference between sort of the cryptocurrency space and a lot of the volatility that defines that space, or has at least for the past couple of years, and then what we're talking about when we talk about enterprise applications of blockchain, are fundamentally different. Fundamentally different ecosystems, fundamentally different technology architectures, different decision makers, different architectures of, how this would actually be implemented, public versus private, who can actually see the transactions, who can join these, totally different spaces. I actually really think that we will see a sort of real bifurcation in the market where maybe we'll come up with a new term for enterprise blockchain. But one will be driven, by a wide open developer community of crypto enthusiasts, of individual developers, and many startups, and the other will be driven by large corporations, governments, enterprise settings, and these will look very, very different. I'm already seeing
the term distributed ledger for enterprise apps emerge, rather than blockchain.
Yeah. And, the other piece, too, when it comes to hype is that, rightfully so, many companies and individuals are waiting to see what regulators do with this. How will the SEC determine a security? If a token takes on this nomenclature and these regulations, that will be very different than if it doesn't. Sure. And that's just one example. So there are many different examples across virtually every industry that have these kinds of, what happens if, and by the way, this looks different in different jurisdictions. So there's some kind of big pieces that need to come into focus before we can move this into scale. Never mind the scalability of the technology itself.
Sure. So Jeremiah, you talked about sort of bringing this to light by some use cases or some examples, and sort of telling us about how this actually works in reality for both kind of an organization and also their customers. So that'd be great if you could tell us a couple of stories around that, and so give us some case examples.
Sure, that's the best way to really tell the story to light. And so most of the examples that we saw, we have around 9, is that companies are making pronouncements that they're going to, or they intend to, launch blockchain for loyalty. Very few have actually done it.
Okay.
But that's still a key indicator when you see that many companies that there's something here.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's a restaurant group called Chanticleer, and they own a number of burger and Just Fresh and Hooters and Little Big Burger. They plan to create a blockchain-based loyalty coin using their own brand. Mm-hmm. So when consumers or patrons use those or patronize those restaurants, they will get a piece of that token. Mm-hmm. And that could be used and converted to something else. Similarly, the very large e-commerce company, Rakuten, the Japanese company, the Amazon in Japan, they announced at Mobile World Congress that they're going to create their own Rakuten coin, and that will offer loyalty programs for their own customers. And just one more here, and then Jessica could provide some examples, is Singapore Airlines announced that they'll have a blockchain loyalty wallet that will be shared across a number of retail partners for their frequent flyers who have those points. Mm-hmm. And so why would they do this? It's because everybody can keep track of where the points are amongst the multiple partners, and it will provide some clarity. And because it's branded with that particular brand's coin, it provides some additional brand preference. Jessica?
Yeah. There's another example by China UnionPay, I believe in partnership with IBM, which is really about designing a points exchange platform across I think it's something like 200 of their partners as a retail bank. And then Kik, this is a little bit different. Kik is a messaging app, but they have developed, and this is underway, I believe, they have developed their own currency called Kin as a way to, buy, sell, trade, monetize content creators and advertisers within the messaging platform. A little bit different, but I mentioned that one because even across all of these examples, we can see kind of different ways of thinking about this loyalty opportunity. One, for example, is a points exchange platform. Another, in the case of Rakuten, is a Rakuten coin, something that is very, very branded, that is specifically for the services of Rakuten. Rakuten also is getting into the telco MVNO market, which makes this much, gives it a hardware platform. It's an interesting play there. Singapore Airlines is doing a very private blockchain across their different partners. We talked about Chanticleer of having sort of an exchange across many different brands. And so you can see these kinds of different ways of thinking about, do we have a universal token? Do we have a branded token? Is it just an exchange platform with many different kinds of tokens? The jury is still out as to what will really take shape, but it's been interesting to see some of the different manifestations, even if, as Jeremiah said, it's very early days.
And does that mean that the from a customer perspective, they may actually not notice a huge amount of difference? It's almost like it's going to make almost the integrity of the loyalty scheme kind of like tighter, but also reduce the complexity if you've got a number of partners from an organizational perspective. Am I right in saying that?
Well, let's certainly hope so. The last thing that we want is to have hundreds of different tokens that consumers are expected to keep up with and sort of optimize on and really manage as a whole new realm of financial management. I'm not sure if that will take traction in the mainstream market, which makes something like a universal token or at least a universal exchange program seem more likely. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, simplicity wins. Whatever is the simplest to use, I think, will bear the best.
Yeah, just kind of because it seems to me is that I can understand why the organizations would do it, because as kind of, if you like, partners kind of go up, the number of partners go up, and the kind of level of complexity goes up, and the tracking and liability and the ledger part of it all just kind of just complexity just goes through the roof. Mm-hmm. To add the other dimension onto it, which is, and now I have to explain it to thousands, if not millions of people, what blockchain is and what tokens are. That just feels just like a headache waiting to happen.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's why we see the pronouncements while companies are doing this, because I think there's a PR benefit of making these announcements. And it's often done around a tech conference in many cases. Mm-hmm. There's just a lot of hype, and there's going to be a point where there's just so much token fatigue where consumers don't want to deal with all of these wallets and coins. It's just going to be a headache. Yeah. And we might, and at that point, if there's too many, we might see a push towards consolidation. Maybe we centralize on some type of coin. Maybe it's Ethereum or blockchain or something, and everybody just standardizes on that. That's a possibility that could happen. And there's just a lot of questions around the scalability of this technology. For example, some of my tech friends say it's a really silly technology because it's a slowly updated database. It's just very hard for it to be updated when it's distributed in all of those different locations. And that's often one of the biggest criticisms.
Yeah, there's also there's also this other sort of emerging criticism around energy consumption and blockchain as well.
Yeah.
Which is I would guess needs to be a question that needs to get answered or addressed over time.
Yeah, it simply must. And this is really the case when it comes to public blockchains. So the Bitcoin blockchain is probably the most at fault or guilty of this particular energy sin, and it's really quite terrible. I mean, I read a study the other day that recently came out that was something like the average daily usage of Australia, or the average daily energy use of Australia is what Bitcoin is using in a proof of work consensus algorithms. Something like every day or something. Right. And over the course of the next 3 years, it will become the size of the United States energy consumption. I mean, it's simply just untenable. And that said, and this gets really important back to this piece I keep harping on of private versus public. When we talk about private blockchains, and especially in the early days, most of the applications using loyalty will be run on private blockchains. They will use a fundamentally different kind of consensus algorithm than what the Bitcoin and what many, even Ethereum, what public blockchain or distributed ledger architectures are using. The other piece on that is that what we're also seeing is different configurations coming to market that are addressing specifically these scalability and energy consumption pieces. So I'm pretty confident that over the next 3 years, because there's so much investment, there's so much hype, there's so much challenge around this specific element of how much energy we're using to process a transaction, that this will slowly be worked out. Ethereum itself is forking to help deal with this very soon. It's a huge issue today. But.
And so, I mean, this is fascinating, and it's kind of very. I mean, even though you have the pronouncements now, I mean, and you've been able to find sort of 9 examples, and I'm sure that a number is going to grow. It is, we must admit, this is very early stage evolution, kind of right now. So, how do you actually see this progressing over time? You know, this is the first part of the tide, or is the first part of the tidal wave?
Well, I think, I look at sort of 3 areas of evolution. In terms of the market evolution, some of those elements I just mentioned about technology scaling, about sort of deconfiguring all of the different pieces that live under the distributed ledger technology umbrella and working on just the scalability issues. There will be some big changes to come to the technology from a market side. Over the next 3 or 4 years, theoretically as well, people will become a little bit more accustomed to this technology. Let's hope that some of the hype starts to iron itself out. From an enterprise evolution side, one of the things that we see taking shape in other industries is this push towards industry consortia.
Right.
So a real estate consortia, a transportation consortia, IoT consortia, there are insurance consortia, there are many different consortia, all in the name of getting the relevant and interested players around the table to help start to talk about this, work out some of the issues, begin to think about what those smart contracts would actually look like, because they're pulling in multiple companies, rules and business logic. What if a consortia in the loyalty space begin to shake out, or airlines, or retail banks? This is not far-fetched, and I think would be an accelerator. Also, there are startups in this space that are brand new. There are startups in this space that are marketing companies that are now pivoting into the blockchain side. So these are companies that have, hundreds or thousands of large retail clients who they're already helping with digital marketing campaigns. And then now they're beginning to add a blockchain-based layer to this. I think that is a catalyst in some way. Or if we see a very large, one of the big 5 gorillas in the room begin to implement this, that could take the market in a different direction. So it's very early days, but I think any kind of one of these will catalyze this.
Right.
Right. So if I could just add a little bit to that, it feels like we're in the early 1990s when we saw the rise of the internet. The systems don't work well together. People are cobbling them together. You had to code them yourself. There's not clear agreement on protocols and standards. Even in the 90s, early 90s, some of the email systems wouldn't even work. You couldn't even email somebody with a different email domain name.
Sure.
So it's still very, very early. But to be clear, I think blockchain and distributed technologies is just a continuation of the internet. So the internet democratized the ability for anybody to publish and find information, regardless of having a centralized conduit. Then we found, but you had to have technical skills. And then social media enabled anybody without technical skills to publish and read content. And then the sharing collaborative economy, we saw peer-to-peer commerce, crowdfunding, which is enabling anybody to fund these things. These are all distributed systems that enable the power to shift to the outsides. And so blockchain is doing this yet again. So it's the same pattern in a different way.
Yeah, sure.
Very true.
I think what's interesting as well is that you talk about consortia, and Jeremiah, you talk about collaboration around early stages of the internet. It reminds me also of the consortia or the collaboration, the agreements that were reached between the different mobile phone companies and networks and standards back in the day around interoperability. So you ended
exactly.
So we ended up with a GSM. Rather than all these kind of like, I've got a mobile phone in Europe and it doesn't work in America, but sometimes works in Japan, blah, blah, blah. But then, so now it's like everything's connected. And so that feels that there's definitely precedent there. And it feels like it feels like when large organizations turn on to this, that's kind of feels like an obvious way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, that's right.
So Jessica and Jeremiah, if I was to say to you, I've got some people that are listening to this. They're maybe leaders. They're maybe entrepreneurs. They're in that sort of marketing space, possibly connected to loyalty. They're going, "Ooh, okay, that sounds interesting." What would you advise them to do? I mean, where should they start? What should they start doing? What should they start thinking about? As a way of sort of just getting started with this, because it's exciting, it's interesting, but it's also really complicated.
Well, first look for the business problem, and let's just again. And we're business folks that look at technology to impact businesses.
Yeah.
We're not looking at technology for the sake of. So if you have a fragmented customer experience in your loyalty program with many different providers that may not know each other nor trust each other, and you can't keep track of the loyalty program and experience, then this use case might make sense for you.
Mm-hmm.
Jessica, what would you add?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, looking at the business cases is a core first step. As you mentioned before, a lot of companies are trying to just do something in blockchain to say they're doing something in blockchain, and so it really does mean starting with an actual use case that solves a current problem today. Mm-hmm. Where, for example, are there transactional dependencies? To what extent does your company have to rely on other parties simply to process a single transaction? Where are there shared repositories around which entire industries of intermediaries are simply doing reconciliation? These are pretty good places to look for some immediate ROI. And then the other thing that we always say is thinking about these consortia. There are different consortia and they offer different value schemes, but the most important of which is getting around the table with the companies who you may or may not be doing business with today. They might even be competitors, but thinking about how to encode rules and reconciliation together into a shared distributed ledger. This requires sitting around a shared group. That's a really important one, and looking for some of the test beds, which often come out of these consortia, as a way to really pilot and test and create small proofs of concept. This is essential. The final one I would add that I think often gets lost in the blockchain space is, because we don't think of it necessarily as consumer focused, but CX and UX are still incredibly important. Building out dashboards, getting people to actually use these technologies, getting employees to register information. Over and over, companies have continued to reassert the importance of UX and building this out. So I often offer that as well.
Perfect. And finally, is there anything that you'd like to add about this whole space and kind of blockchain and marketing and loyalty and things before I ask you my final question?
Mm-hmm.
I think we covered it. It's early days, in my opinion.
It's very early days. We're looking, so our whole angle is looking at the kaleidoscope of technologies, looking at where these things intersect with existing and other emerging technologies. And so this is something we're tracking closely. We've looked at where IoT and connected devices come together with blockchain. We're also looking now at digital identity, at advertising and media supply chain. So there's lots of, and this is just the tip of the iceberg for marketers, but we're really focused on where these worlds begin to influence each other's development.
Perfect. So Jessica, Jeremiah, this brings me to my final question I always ask at the end of these podcasts. And the question is this: is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Well, thank you everybody for your time. Hopefully we've shown some expertise on looking at new technologies. And we do offer advisory services, education services, professional speaking to the world's largest companies and medium-sized companies, and would love to partner with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Echoing that, of course. And I have one other shameless plug, which is we're running a survey on blockchain for brands. What are brands doing? How are they experimenting with thinking about the technology? I promise it takes less than 5 minutes. In fact, the average completion time is 2 minutes and 10 seconds, so it's very, very lightweight. I won't bore the readers by reading a URL, but maybe we could pop that into an email or something, or feel free to contact us directly. But it's a short, quick survey, blockchain for brands.
Perfect. What I will do is I will make sure I get all that kind of linked up so we can promote that. But I'm pretty sure that you could probably find the link to the survey on Kaleido Insights website. Jessica, Jeremiah, thank you for your time today and, pulling back the curtain a little bit on some of this blockchain stuff, and particularly when it comes to the areas of customer service and customer experience, which I'm really interested in. I mean, that's been really helpful. I'm sure the listeners and readers have found it really helpful. And thanks again for your time today. That's been awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Great
Adrian.
Podcast. Thank you so much.
This is fun.
Well, that's it for another interview. I really hope you enjoyed it. Now, every time I complete one of these interviews, I learn something new, and I try and incorporate that new learning into my writing, my speaking, my workshops, and the consulting that I do for my clients. If you're interested, you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswimsco.com. But one final thing before I go. Please consider heading over to iTunes or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do listen in again. All the very best.